A woman may survive poverty, hunger, and winter, but there is a particular cruelty in being laughed at by people who have never had to survive anything at all. The whisper slipped through the gold-lit ballroom of Whitmore Hall like a blade drawn quietly from silk. Emily Carter heard it before she saw the woman who had spoken. She had been standing beneath the crystal chandelier, one gloved hand resting lightly on the arm of Duke Alexander Whitmore, her new husband, while 200 candles trembled in their silver branches and painted every polished surface with a warm, merciless glow. Outside, snow pressed against the tall windows in soft white sheets, muffling the world beyond the estate's stone walls. Inside, the air smelled of roses, beeswax, expensive perfume, and judgment. Emily had never seen so many jewels gathered in one room. Diamonds flashed at pale throats. Pearls lay against satin like small moons. Every gown seemed to whisper of old money, old blood, old names carved deep into American society's grandest houses from Boston to Newport. She had entered with her chin lifted, as Alexander had instructed, wearing a simple ivory gown chosen by the Duchess's dressmaker and a pair of white gloves mended so carefully that only she knew where the old seams had once been. For one breath, the room had gone still. Then the murmurs began. "There she is," Lady Marlowe said, her fan half raised, her smile thin as frost. "The Duke's charity bride." A ripple of laughter passed from one jeweled mouth to another, soft enough to pretend it was polite, sharp enough to reach its mark. Emily felt the word strike somewhere beneath her ribs. Charity bride. Not duchess. Not wife. Not woman. A charitable object dressed in silk and placed beside a man too powerful to be questioned. She did not look down. She had learned, long before marriage placed a title before her name, that humiliation became easier for cruel people when they could see it land. So she stood very still, her fingers closing once around the stem of her untouched glass of water. Across the ballroom, Lady Marlowe's companions watched with the satisfied patience of people waiting for a poor girl to prove she did not belong. Emily's throat tightened, but she swallowed the ache. She thought of the small rented room in Boston where rain had leaked through the ceiling in 3 places. She thought of her brother sleeping under 2 thin blankets while she stitched gowns for women who would never know her name. She thought of cold mornings, unpaid bills, and the quiet dignity of washing one's only pair of gloves by hand because there was no money for another. She was not ashamed of that life. She was only wounded that they had turned Alexander's name into a joke because he had joined it to hers. Beside her, Duke Whitmore did not move. His face remained composed, almost carved from the same pale stone as the columns behind him. To anyone watching, he looked indifferent. To Emily, that silence felt suddenly vast. Perhaps he regretted it. Perhaps, in the bright cruelty of his own world, he had finally seen what others saw. A seamstress made Duchess by mistake. Then she noticed his hand. The one resting on the silver head of his cane had tightened until the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. His dark eyes were not on her. They were on every face that had laughed. The orchestra continued its careful waltz, though even the violins seemed uneasy. Lady Marlowe lifted her glass, emboldened by the Duke's silence. "Your Grace," she called with honeyed brightness, "we were only admiring your generosity. Few men would turn charity into matrimony." This time, the laughter came louder. Emily's breath caught, but she did not step back. She stood in the center of all that golden light, pour in their eyes, trembling only where no one could see, while the man beside her lowered his cane against the marble floor with one quiet sound. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The ballroom began to fall silent. The sound of Alexander Whitmore's cane against the marble did what raised voices could not have done. It gathered the room by the throat without touching anyone at all. One by one, conversations broke apart and disappeared. Fans stopped moving. A laugh died behind a gloved hand. Even the orchestra seemed to soften, the violins thinning into a nervous thread beneath the glittering ceiling. Emily Carter felt the silence turn toward her like 100 cold faces. She could sense Lady Marlowe waiting for her to wilt, waiting for some proof that a girl born outside the old families could not bear the weight of a name like Whitmore. Yet Emily remained where she stood, though the floor beneath her felt suddenly too bright, too wide, too polished for her worn memories. Her gown was beautiful, but it did not feel like armor. It felt like a question everyone in the room had already answered against her. She knew what they saw. They saw no inherited estate, no grandfather painted in oil above a private library, no summer house on the coast, no mother who had taught her which fork to lift at a formal dinner. They saw a woman who had once walked nearly 2 miles through Boston snow because streetcar fare had been the difference between bread and an unpaid bill. They saw hands that had held needles more often than calling cards. They saw a bride without a bloodline, and in their world, that was almost the same as being invisible. But Emily had not been invisible to hunger. She had not been invisible to winter. She had not been invisible to the small boy coughing in the next room while she sat beneath a leaking roof, sewing pearls onto a gown worth more than 6 months of rent. She had learned to count coins by candlelight. She had learned to smile at women who complained about the color of imported silk while her own fingers ached from the cold. She had learned that kindness, when one possessed nothing else, was not weakness. It was the last estate of the soul. Still, Alexander's silence wounded her more sharply than Lady Marlowe's insult. It had been Alexander who told her, on the morning of their wedding, that she must never bow to cruelty disguised as manners. It had been Alexander who stood beside her at the chapel doors with a face as solemn as carved oak and said, "Whatever they think you lack, Emily, do not help them believe it." But now the cruelty had come dressed in diamonds, and he had not yet spoken. Perhaps he had discovered that courage was easier in private than before the society that had made him. Perhaps a duke could marry a poor woman behind closed doors, but could not defend her beneath chandeliers where every noble eye was watching. Emily turned her face slightly, just enough to see him from beneath her lashes. Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Lady Marlowe. His expression was calm, but there was nothing empty in that calm. It was the stillness of a house before thunder reaches the windows. His jaw tightened once. His cane remained planted on the marble. Lady Marlowe, mistaking restraint for permission, smiled wider. "Of course," she said, letting each word float sweetly through the room. "We all admire compassion. It is one of the finest ornaments a gentleman may wear." A few guests dared to smile again. Emily felt heat rise behind her eyes and forced it back. She would not give them tears. Not here. Not while Alexander's name stood beside hers. Then the Duke finally turned his head, not toward Lady Marlowe, but toward Emily. His gaze met hers fully for the first time since the insult had been spoken. There was no shame in it. No apology for having chosen her. Only something deep, controlled, and fierce enough to make her breath still. Very quietly, so only she could hear, he said, "Do not lower your eyes." Emily's fingers loosened around the glass. She lifted her chin, and only then did Alexander Whitmore face the room. Alexander Whitmore allowed the silence to deepen until it became heavier than any accusation. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed volume to command a room that had spent generations teaching itself to obey titles, fortunes, and old family names. The candlelight rested along the sharp line of his black evening coat, caught the silver at his cuff, and glinted once on the head of his cane as though the object itself had become a warning. Emily stood at his side with her chin lifted, though her heart moved like a frightened bird beneath satin and lace. The guests watched him with careful smiles fading from their faces. They expected a polite correction, perhaps a cold remark dressed in manners, perhaps nothing more than the Duke protecting his pride from becoming the evening's entertainment. They did not understand that Alexander was not thinking of pride. He was thinking of memory. He remembered every word spoken since Emily entered the ballroom. He remembered Lord Pembroke leaning toward his wife and murmuring that American society had become dangerously sentimental. He remembered Miss Adeline Frost studying Emily's simple necklace as if poverty might be contagious. He remembered Lady Marlowe's laugh most of all, soft, cultivated, and cruel, the laugh of a woman who had never known the cost of bread, coal, or medicine when the purse held only pennies. Alexander had been raised among such people. He knew their language. They could turn insult into compliment, exclusion into etiquette, and cowardice into caution. For years, he had mastered their game. He had become colder than they were, quieter than they were, more difficult to read than any man in Boston or Newport society. But Emily had never learned that game. That was precisely why he had married her. Not because she was helpless, because she was not ruined by pretending. Lady Marlowe's smile faltered beneath his attention, though she tried to preserve it. "Your Grace," she said lightly. "Surely you know we mean no offense. We only find the match rather unexpected." "Unexpected," Alexander repeated. The word crossed the ballroom slowly, stripped of its silk. "How gentle a word for what you meant." No one moved. Emily felt the faintest tremor pass through the hand nearest his sleeve, and she folded her fingers into her palm before anyone could see. Alexander saw it anyway. He saw everything. He had seen her pretend not to hear the first whisper. He had seen her endure the second. He had seen the small, disciplined breath she took before deciding not to break. His anger did not flare wildly. It settled. It became exact. That was what made it dangerous. He could have ended the matter with one sentence. He could have announced that anyone who insulted his wife would leave Whitmore Hall before the next waltz. He could have made them afraid of offending a duke. But fear would not cleanse the room of what had been said. Fear would only teach them silence without shame. Alexander wanted more. He wanted truth placed before them so plainly that every polished mirror in the ballroom would seem to accuse them. "You are correct about one thing," he said at last. Lady Marlowe brightened, too foolishly relieved. "This marriage did begin with charity." A murmur stirred. Emily's breath stopped. For one terrible second, she thought the floor had vanished beneath her. Then Alexander turned slightly, his eyes resting on her not with pity, but with reverence. "But not mine," he said. The murmur died. 3 years ago, before most of you found it fashionable to praise mercy at dinner and refuse it at the door, a woman with almost nothing opened her home to a stranger who had no name worth offering her. Emily stared at him, confusion and memory rising together like mist. A narrow room, rain against glass, a fevered man beneath a worn blanket, a voice in the dark. Alexander looked back to the crowd, and when he spoke again, every candle in Whitmore Hall seemed to hold its flame still. "You have called her small because she was poor. I tell you now, there are fortunes in this room that could not purchase 1 hour of the grace she gave freely." For a moment, Emily could not breathe. The ballroom around her blurred into candlelight and silk, but the memory Alexander had summoned returned with the sharpness of winter rain against thin glass. 3 years earlier, she had lived above a small dressmaker's shop on a narrow Boston street, where the gas lamps burned low after midnight, and the wind found every crack in the window frame. She had been 22, tired beyond tears, with $6 hidden in a blue teacup and a younger brother asleep behind a curtain because there had been no money for a proper second room. That night, the rain had come hard, turning the street below into black ribbons of water. Emily had been working by candlelight, sewing seed pearls along the sleeve of a wedding gown for a woman who had complained that the shade of ivory was not delicate enough. Her fingers were stiff. Her eyes burned. Still, she worked, because the landlord had already knocked twice that week, and the doctor had warned that her brother's cough would worsen without medicine. Then came the sound at the back door. Not a knock. Something weaker. A hand against wood, then silence. Emily had frozen with the needle in her fingers. In her world, opening a door after midnight was not wise. A woman alone learned caution the way others learn music, note by fearful note. Yet the sound came again, lower this time, followed by a breath that did not belong to sleep or drunkenness, but exhaustion. She took the lamp and descended the narrow stairs. Rain swept across the small courtyard. A man stood there in a dark coat soaked through, one hand braced against the brick wall, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. He looked like someone who had walked too far in whether no sensible person would challenge. "Sir," she had whispered, "are you ill?" He tried to answer, but only managed her name. Not her full name, just the name written on the small brass plate beside the shop door. "Carter." His voice broke on it. Emily should have called for help. She should have stepped back. Instead, she saw the tremor in his shoulders, the feverish brightness in his eyes, and the terrible loneliness of a man who expected the door to close. So she opened it wider. "Come inside before the cold finishes what the rain began," she said. He had given no title, no explanation, no promise of payment. He had only crossed the threshold like a shadow surrendering to light. Emily laid him on the narrow sofa, warmed water on the stove, and spent the last of her medicine money on quinine and clean bandages from the apothecary 2 streets away. For 3 nights, she changed cloths on his brow, fed him broth by the spoon, and spoke to him when his fever made him restless. He never told her he was Duke Alexander Whitmore. He never told her that powerful men would have opened grand doors for him had they known his name. She only knew he was a stranger left outside in the cold. And Emily Carter had never been able to pass suffering by and call it none of her business. In the ballroom, Alexander's voice brought her back. She did not ask who I was, he said. She did not ask what my name could do for her. She had almost nothing, and still she gave me shelter. Lady Marlowe's face had lost its color. Several guests looked away as if the chandeliers had become too bright. Emily turned toward Alexander, the truth unfolding inside her with a quiet pain. He had remembered. All these years, he had remembered. Emily remembered the morning after the stranger's fever broke. Pale dawn had entered the little room above the dressmaker's shop, turning the cracked window silver and laying a thin line of light across the floorboards. Her brother Daniel still slept behind the curtain, one small hand curled beneath his cheek, while the man on the sofa opened his eyes with the quiet confusion of someone returning from a far country. He had looked at the low ceiling, the chipped wash basin, the single chair with one leg mended by twine, then at Emily standing beside the stove with a cup of weak tea in her hands. "You should not have taken me in," he had said, his voice rough from illness. Emily had answered without thinking. No one should be left outside in the cold. It had seemed a simple sentence then, hardly worth remembering. She had not known that it would follow him for 3 years. She had not known he would leave before sunrise 2 days later, placing an unsigned envelope beneath the teacup she used for rent money. Inside had been enough cash to pay the landlord, the doctor, and 3 months of coal. Emily had searched the street, but he was gone, swallowed by fog and morning traffic, leaving only a note written in a firm, elegant hand. "Forgive the trouble I brought to your door." Years passed, and life did what life often does to gentle people with little protection. It asked more of her. The dressmaker died suddenly. The shop closed. Daniel's health improved, then faltered again, then improved by the grace of careful doctors and Emily's relentless labor. She took work where she could find it, sewing hems for wealthy families, repairing lace no one thanked her for saving, altering gowns for young women who spoke over her head as if she were furniture. Then came the false accusation that ruined her completely. A pearl clasp went missing from a client's evening cape, and because Emily was poor, suspicion found her more quickly than truth. She denied it with calm dignity, but dignity did not weigh much against a lady's offended pride. By the end of the week, doors closed. Commissions vanished. Rent came due. Daniel was sent to stay with a kindly schoolmaster outside the city, because Emily would rather be alone than let him watch their room empty piece by piece. It was then that Alexander returned, not as the nameless fevered stranger from the rain, but as Duke Alexander Whitmore, standing in the narrow hallway of the boarding house while the landlady stared as if a portrait had stepped out of its frame. Emily had been packing her last trunk, folding the same worn gloves she wore now beneath the chandeliers of Whitmore Hall. "Miss Carter," he had said, removing his hat, "I have come to offer you my name." She had thought, at first, that she misunderstood him. Men like Alexander did not marry women like her. They hired them, pitted them, dismissed them, or forgot them. He did none of those things. He told her the accusation had been false, that the missing clasp had been found, that the apology would never be loud enough to repair what silence had destroyed. Then he asked her to become his wife. Emily had searched his face for mockery and found none. "Why?" she whispered. Alexander's answer had been quiet. "Because 3 years ago, when I had nothing to offer, you gave without asking what I was worth. I would like to spend the rest of my life honoring what you are worth." She had accepted with fear, gratitude, and a heart too guarded to understand that she was not being rescued from ruin. She was being remembered. Now, in the ballroom, with every noble eye fixed upon them, Emily understood the marriage everyone had misunderstood. Alexander had not chosen her to display his generosity. He had chosen her because once, in a cold room above a shuttered shop, she had shown him the kind of grace no title could teach. Lady Marlowe had meant to wound a seamstress and amuse a ballroom. Instead, she had opened a door into a truth the room was not prepared to face. The silence around her had changed shape. It no longer belonged to curiosity. It belonged to discomfort. She lifted her chin with the practiced grace of a woman who had survived many social mistakes by pretending they were intentional. "Your Grace," she said, her voice still sweet but thinner now. No one doubts the young lady performed a kindness. It is touching, certainly, but a moment of compassion hardly explains a marriage of such consequence. Alexander looked at her for a long second, and the warmth seemed to leave the candlelight. "You are right," he said. A small breath passed through the guests. Lady Marlowe almost smiled. Emily felt Alexander's sleeve shift beside her, not away, but nearer, as if he had placed himself more firmly between her and the room without taking a step. "A single moment of compassion does not explain this marriage," he continued. "That is why I shall tell you the rest." The orchestra had stopped completely now. No one had instructed the musicians to lower their instruments. They had simply done it, as if sound itself had become improper. Alexander turned to the gathering, and his voice remained calm, each word measured with a precision that made interruption impossible. "When Miss Carter lost her work because a foolish accusation traveled faster than the truth, many of the families in this room knew she was innocent before the week ended." A color rose in Miss Adeline Frost's cheeks. Lord Pembroke looked down into his wine. Lady Marlowe's fingers tightened around her fan. Emily stood motionless, the old shame returning, but altered now by the strange and aching knowledge that Alexander had seen more than she had ever told him. "The clasp was found," Alexander said. "The apology was written in private. The damage was permitted to remain public." His gaze moved from one face to another. No one met it for long. A woman's name was allowed to suffer because it was convenient for those with better names to remain comfortable. Emily remembered the day the pearl clasp had been discovered behind the lining of the client's own cape. She remembered the note sent by a maid, not the lady herself, informing her that the matter had been resolved. Resolved, as though hunger resolved when pride did. As though a closed door opened because someone whispered regret behind it. Lady Marlowe tried once more. "Surely society cannot be blamed for every misfortune, Your Grace. We all have reputations to protect." "Indeed," Alexander said. "And some of you protected yours by sacrificing hers." The words were not loud, but they struck with the finality of a church bell in winter. Emily looked at the women who had once sent gowns to her room and then sent silence when she needed truth. Their diamonds still shone. Their gloves were still spotless. Yet for the first time, they seemed less grand than she remembered. Alexander reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small folded paper, aged at the edges. Emily recognized it before he opened it. Her own handwriting. A page torn from the ledger she had kept above the shop, where every penny for medicine, coal, rent, and bread had been recorded in careful columns. "This," he said, holding it gently, "is the account of what she spent the night she saved my life. $2 for medicine, 50 cents for broth, $1 for clean linen. The last of her coal burned before dawn." His voice softened, but the room did not. She owed rent. Her brother needed care. She had no certainty that the stranger on her sofa would ever wake, much less repay her. Yet she chose mercy. Emily's eyes stung, but she did not lower them. Alexander turned toward her then, and the severity in his face eased into something so quiet that it hurt more than tenderness spoken aloud. "They call it charity because they have never understood sacrifice," he said. Then he faced the nobles again. "Do not insult what you are too poor in spirit to recognize." The ballroom held its breath, and Lady Marlowe's fan closed with a small, defeated sound. The room had been conquered without a shout, yet victory did not feel bright to Emily Carter. It felt like standing beneath a sky after thunder, when the air is clean but every branch still trembles. She heard nothing for several seconds except the small sounds people make when they are afraid to be noticed. A throat cleared too softly, a skirt rustling against polished marble, the faint clink of a glass being set down with too much care. Lady Marlowe no longer looked at her. That, more than any apology, told Emily how completely the world had turned. A little while ago, those same eyes had examined her as though she were an unfortunate object placed in a beautiful room by mistake. Now they avoided her as one avoids a mirror after committing an unkindness. Alexander stood beside her, still holding the old ledger page between his fingers, and Emily felt the strange ache of being defended so thoroughly that her own heart had not yet caught up with it. She had spent years protecting her memories from pity. She had folded hardship into silence, pressed shame flat like a letter hidden beneath a mattress, and carried on because the next bill, the next meal, The next winter always arrived whether one was wounded or not. She had never imagined that anyone had been reading the quiet account of her survival. She had never imagined that the man she had married had studied her poverty not as proof of low standing, but as evidence of courage. Lord Pembroke shifted near the fireplace, his round face damp with embarrassment. "Your Grace," he began, attempting a smile that found no life in his cheeks. "Surely we have all misunderstood the nature of the evening." No insult was intended toward her Grace. Her Grace. The words settled into the ballroom with an unfamiliar weight. Emily had heard servants use the title since her wedding, always carefully, sometimes kindly, sometimes with curiosity. But from Lord Pembroke's mouth, before the people who had laughed, it sounded almost like surrender. Alexander did not answer him at once. Instead, he folded the ledger page with deliberate care, as though it were something sacred, and placed it back inside his coat. "Misunderstanding is what people call cruelty when witnesses become inconvenient," he said. Lord Pembroke lowered his eyes. A few faces turned toward Lady Marlowe, hoping she might repair what she had damaged, but she stood rigid beneath her diamonds, her beauty sharpened by humiliation. Emily should have felt satisfied. She did not. She looked at the woman and saw, beneath the lace and jewels, something smaller than power. Fear. Fear of losing place. Fear of being laughed at next. Fear that kindness, if honored too highly, might expose how little of it they had practiced. Emily's anger softened, not into forgiveness, but into understanding. Cruelty was often only cowardice wearing gloves. Then Alexander turned fully toward her, and the room seemed to fall away from the edges of her vision. "Emily," he said, not Duchess, not Miss Carter, not a title offered for display, but her name, spoken with a quiet gravity that reached farther than all the chandeliers. "I should have told you long before tonight that I remembered." Her lips parted, but no words came. In his eyes she saw not the cold duke the newspapers described, not the powerful man society feared disappointing, but the stranger from the rain, the weary man on her narrow sofa, the one who had once opened his eyes to a poor room and found himself treated as if his life mattered before his name did. "I thought," she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "that you married me because I had nowhere else to go." Something passed through his face then, a pain so controlled it was almost invisible. "No," he said, "I married you because I spent 3 years knowing exactly where I wished to go, and it was wherever your kindness had gone." Emily's hand trembled once at her side. This time, Alexander did not merely notice. He reached for it in front of everyone, slowly enough to give her the choice, gently enough to make the choice safe. She placed her gloved hand in his. The contact was simple, proper, and yet the entire ballroom seemed to understand that something more binding than ceremony had just taken place. Alexander lifted her hand, not to display possession, but to honor it, and faced the room again. "You will address my wife with the respect due to her," he said. "Not because she carries my name, but because she carried mercy when most of you would have locked the door." No one laughed. No one whispered. And in that silence, Emily finally felt the title Duchess settle upon her shoulders, not like borrowed silk, but like something she had earned long before anyone had known to call it by name. The first apology came from a woman Emily barely remembered. Mrs. Caroline Vale, a widow in gray silk, stepped forward from beside the fireplace with her gloved hands clasped tightly at her waist. Her jewels were modest compared with Lady Marlowe's, but her eyes carried something more difficult than pride. Shame. She curtsied, not to Alexander, but to Emily. "Your Grace," she said, and the title did not sound like surrender this time. It sounded like a bridge being built with trembling hands. "I purchased 3 gowns from you the winter, Mrs. Halstead accused you. When the clasp was found, I knew, and I said nothing because I feared being drawn into unpleasantness." The word unpleasantness seemed to wound her as soon as she spoke it. She lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." The ballroom did not move. Emily looked at the older woman and felt the old instinct rise within her, the instinct to make another person comfortable even at her own expense. She had done it all her life. She had smiled when clients were rude, thanked people who underpaid her, accepted apologies that were never spoken because survival often required quietness. But tonight, with Alexander's hand steady around hers and every candle seeming to wait for her answer, She understood that mercy did not require her to erase the truth. "Thank you for saying it aloud," Emily replied. Her voice was soft, but it reached the far side of the room. Mrs. Vale's lips trembled, and she stepped back. After that, the silence changed again. Not lighter, more honest. One by one, faces shifted from judgment to recognition, as if the guests were being forced to see the woman they had tried to reduce into a story small enough to laugh at. Miss Adeline Frost did not apologize, but she lowered her fan and looked at Emily with something like unease. Lord Pembroke bowed stiffly from the waist. Several younger women exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain, perhaps wondering how many times they had repeated a cruelty simply because it had sounded clever when someone powerful said it first. Lady Marlowe remained motionless. Her diamonds glittered at her throat, bright and useless. Alexander turned toward her with the patience of a man who had not finished. "There is one more matter," he said. Lady Marlowe's face tightened. "Your Grace, surely enough has been said." "Not nearly." He released Emily's hand only long enough to signal to the steward standing near the doorway. The steward approached carrying a slim leather folio, dark brown and worn at the corners. Emily recognized nothing about it, yet a strange stillness entered Alexander's expression as he opened it. "Some of you assumed I brought my wife here tonight to test whether society would accept her," he said. "You were mistaken. I brought society here to witness what she has already begun." He drew out several neatly folded documents and placed them on the small marble-top table beside him. "This morning, the Whitmore Shelter Fund was legally established in my wife's name. Its first house will open in Boston before the end of winter, less than 4 miles from the room where she once took in a stranger." A murmur rose, but this time it held no laughter. Emily stared at him. "Alexander," she whispered. He looked at her, and in the sternness of his face there was a tenderness he had hidden from everyone except her. "You once gave shelter with $6 and a dying fire," he said. "Imagine what you will do with my fortune and every door in this city required to open when you knock." The words struck Emily more deeply than all the insults that had come before. Not because they were grand, but because they understood her. He was not giving her jewels to prove she belonged among the wealthy. He was giving her work worthy of the suffering she had survived. Lady Marlowe drew herself up, desperate for the last fragment of authority. "How noble," she said, though the sweetness had curdled. "A fitting occupation for a woman so familiar with hardship." Alexander's eyes hardened, but Emily gently touched his sleeve before he could answer. Then she faced Lady Marlowe herself. The room stilled around the movement. "Yes," Emily said, "I am familiar with hardship. That is why I recognize it before it becomes scandal, before it becomes gossip, before it becomes a woman standing alone while comfortable people debate whether she deserves help." Lady Marlowe opened her mouth, but no sound came. Emily's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You may keep your approval, Lady Marlowe. I have no use for it. But if ever winter comes to your door in a form you cannot dismiss, I hope someone kinder than you answers." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every word the nobles could no longer say. For several seconds, no one in Whitmore Hall seemed willing to breathe first. Emily Carter stood beneath the chandelier with the Duke's name upon her shoulders and the memory of a cold, rented room still warm in her hands. Across from her, Lady Marlowe looked smaller than she had at the beginning of the evening, not because her gown had lost its splendor or her diamonds had dimmed, but because cruelty, once answered with truth, has nowhere elegant to stand. The guests waited for Alexander to finish the matter as men of rank usually did, with a command, a dismissal, perhaps the quiet social ruin of those who had offended him. But Alexander did not look at them. He looked only at Emily, and something in his face changed so completely that the room, with all its wealth and judgment, seemed suddenly distant from him. He took one step back, then lowered himself to one knee before her on the marble floor. A gasp moved through the ballroom like wind through winter trees. Emily's hand flew to her heart. "Alexander," she whispered, startled and almost afraid for him, because men like him did not kneel where society could see. Dukes did not lower themselves before seamstresses. Power did not bow to gentleness. At least, that was what every person in the room had believed until that moment. Alexander held out his hand, palm upward, not demanding hers, only offering the place where it might rest. 3 years ago," he said, his voice low but clear enough to reach the farthest candlelit corner. I entered your life as a stranger with nothing but need. You gave me warmth, medicine, and dignity before you knew whether I could repay you. Tonight, they called you fortunate because I gave you my name. They are wrong. Emily's eyes filled, though she did not let the tears fall. The room blurred around the edges, all velvet and gold and astonishment. Alexander continued, and every word seemed to loosen a knot she had carried since the day she first wondered whether gratitude had been mistaken for love. I did not marry beneath me, he said. I spent 3 years becoming worthy enough to stand beside you. No fan moved. No jewel clicked against another. Even Lady Marlowe looked away, as if the sight of a proud man honoring the woman she had mocked was more than she could bear. Emily placed her hand in his. The gesture was small, proper, almost quiet, but the silence that followed made it feel like the turning of a season. Alexander rose, still holding her hand, and for the first time since their wedding day, Emily did not feel like a guest in the life he had offered her. She felt like the center of it. Mrs. Vale bowed again, deeper than before. Lord Pembroke followed. Then another. Then another. Not all from repentance. Some from fear. Some from shame. Some because society often learns decency only after power gives it permission. Yet Emily accepted none of it as proof of her worth. Her worth had existed in the cold room, before titles, before chandeliers, before anyone in silk had thought to recognize it. Alexander turned to the musicians and gave a slight nod. The orchestra, trembling back into life, began a slow waltz. He offered his arm. "May I have this dance, Duchess?" he asked. The word no longer felt borrowed. Emily looked at the marble floor where he had knelt, then at the faces that had once waited for her to break. She took his arm. "Yes, Your Grace," she said softly. Together they stepped into the center of the ballroom, not as a scandal forgiven, not as charity dressed in satin, but as two souls who had found each other in the cold and chosen, before witnesses at last, not to let the world define what mercy had already made sacred. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Boston, covering roofs, streets, and old footprints in white silence. Inside Whitmore Hall, no one spoke her old insult again. In time, people would remember the fund she built, the doors she opened, the women and children who found warmth because she had once known what it meant to have none. They would remember the night a duke knelt before his wife and taught a room full of nobles that grace is not inherited. It is lived. And some hearts only learn to beat rightly when they finally bow before the kindness that saved them.